Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking a necessary, and I have to say, a very stark look at a recent tragedy that has just profoundly affected a nation and really the international community that visits it.
Mm,
We are diving into the fire that engulfed Le Constellation Bar in the high-end Swiss ski resort of Crans, Montana.
that's right. And the focus of this deep dive is, I think, to move past the immediate shock and really try to synthesize the available facts.
Yeah.
We're going to be piecing together the initial investigative findings, the heart-wrenching witness accounts, and some crucial expert commentary about the materials and the safety compliance of that venue.
So our mission here, for you, the listener, is to provide a thorough understanding of how all these failures converged, how a small, almost routine ignition could escalate into a mass casualty incident. I mean, one of historic proportions for Switzerland.
And when we talk about this incident, we're talking about a tragedy that struck right in the early hours of the new year, approximately 1:30 a.m., January 1st, 2026.
Right in the middle of celebrations.
Exactly. The venue was packed, mostly with young people, and the outcome was just horrific. We're looking at an estimated 40 people killed and 119 injured.
When the official figures are that high, the single question that dominates the investigation and our deep dive today is just fundamental. How did an apparently minor spark lead to what the prosecutor herself described as a rapid, very rapid, and widespread conflagration?
Well, our sources for this, which include the initial statements from prosecutor Beatrice Palaud, detailed technical commentary from Swiss fire experts, and, the raw accounts from survivors reported all across European media, they all point to a perfect storm.
It's never one thing, is it?
It's never one thing. It wasn't a single failure, but the interaction of a seemingly innocuous, even accepted practice with these fundamental structural vulnerabilities. We're going to use these materials to analyze not just the chronology of the fire, but the physics and the human decision-making that really dictated that casualty count.
Okay, so let's unpack the ignition point. That's the starting piece of this whole puzzle. It's often the case that these large-scale disasters are triggered by something surprisingly mundane.
Hmm.
And here, the initial cause that investigators have identified seems to be just that, a highly routine commercial spectacle.
Indeed. And prosecutor Beatrice Palaud was very precise in identifying the probable trigger. She stated, and I'm quoting here, everything suggests the fire started from the burning candles or Bengal lights that had been attached to champagne bottles.
The Bengal light. So for those who aren't familiar with that term, we're talking about the fountain sparklers you see in high-end nightclubs all over the world.
Exactly. They're for spectacle. They spray these high-temperature, bright sparks for a short time to announce, a premium order is arriving at a table. It's part of the show.
Part of the atmosphere. But the investigation, it's focused on one crucial error. They were held too close to the ceiling.
That's the critical link. And if this was a routine thing, why did it become so catastrophic this time? That is the question the investigation has to answer.
And the source materials confirm this wasn't some kind of isolated rogue incident.
No, not at all. Multiple witness accounts cited by French, Italian, and Swiss media all confirmed that setting off these sparklers was part of a regular show. It was something the staff did for patrons who made special, expensive orders. It was, for all intents and purposes, an accepted operating procedure for Le Constellation.
And that concept, the accepted routine practice, it's so crucial because it makes the risk invisible
To everyone.
to everyone involved, the staff, the patrons, and maybe even the regulators. If a practice is seen as normal for years, the potential for it to expose a structural vulnerability is just completely overlooked.
Precisely. And the eyewitnesses, they capture the instantaneous nature of this ignition. One witness, who was identified only as Axel, he confirmed the sequence of events. He said, they got too close to the ceiling and suddenly it all caught fire.
So it's a direct link. A routine presentation, which needs vertical space, was performed in a low-ceiling basement.
Directly exposing highly sensitive materials overhead to temperatures that were just far, far beyond their tolerance.
So if we're looking at potential negligence here, is the focus on the immediate staff member who held the bottle too high? Or does the investigation immediately have to zoom out and look at the management's protocol?
Oh, it has to be systemic.
Yeah.
It has to be. The staff member may have lit the fuse, so to speak, but it's management that dictates the operating protocol.
Right.
If management authorized the use of high-heat sparklers in a basement venue where the ceiling clearance was minimal and the material above was flammable, well, then the liability shifts immediately to the owners and operators. It's a failure of their duty of care.
So the investigation has to determine if the routine use of these Bengal lights violated the bar's license or their own internal safety guidelines.
Especially if the renovation materials made that ceiling particularly vulnerable, it transforms it from a simple accident into a systemic exposure of risk.
What's really insightful here is how the commercial drive, the desire to create spectacle and enhance that high-end experience through these shows, directly created the flashpoint. The very thing designed to attract patrons was the instrument that initiated the disaster just because it was combined with the wrong architectural variables.
It's a classic example of what you'd call risk creep. You introduce an element of danger, a high-temperature flare into an environment, and if the structural protection against that risk is inadequate, the consequence is multiplied exponentially.
And the fact that this was a routine performance means that management implicitly accepted this risk every single time they did.
Yes, exposing a critical vulnerability that should have been eliminated during any safety check or any renovation.
So now we move to the part of this deep dive where the physics of the disaster become just terrifyingly clear. We've traced the spark. Now we have to connect that simple ignition to the devastating velocity of the spread. That's the defining characteristic of this catastrophe.
The speed. The speed is what overwhelmed everyone. We have descriptions from mobile phone footage and eyewitness reports detailing this transition from a small flame to a raging fire across the ceiling in seconds.
Seconds.
Prosecutor Pillaud used that very powerful phrase. A rapid, very rapid, and widespread conflagration ensued. The investigation into that sheer velocity, well, it's focused almost entirely on the ceiling materials.
Okay, so let's discuss this critical material hypothesis. There's visual evidence circulating, believed to be the ceiling of that basement venue, and it suggests the space was lined with foam soundproofing panels.
Right. And in a live music venue, particularly one in a basement, you need soundproofing to minimize noise disruption in a dense resort area. It's essential.
But the material choice, in retrospect, appears to have been a death sentence.
That is the nexus of the problem. It's aesthetics versus fire safety. Many modern, low-cost acoustic foams are made from polymers, often polyurethane or similar materials.
And unless they are explicitly treated or manufactured to be fire retardant and critically certified as such,
They burn fiercely and rapidly. The fire expert, Marcus Knorr, who spoke to 20 Minutes, he confirmed this danger. He noted that the type of soundproofing panels used burned fast and burst into flames if they lacked the proper fireproofing.
okay, this is where we need to get a little technical for the listener. Why does acoustic foam specifically burn so aggressively? I mean, even compared to wood or other materials.
Well, it comes down to two properties. First is its chemical composition. Polymers are basically carbon-based fuels. But second, and this is crucial for acoustic foam, is the physical structure.
The shape of it.
The shape, yes. These panels are engineered to be porous, full of air pockets. This maximizes their surface area to absorb sound waves. But that same high surface area means that when fire hits it, oxygen can immediately penetrate and mix with the fuel source across a huge exposed surface. It facilitates nearly instantaneous combustion. It's like having an enormous wick just ready to ignite.
So the very feature that makes it an excellent sound dampener, its high surface area and porous structure, also makes it a perfect accelerant when it's exposed to heat.
Exactly. And the geometry of the installation, how it was put up, it just exacerbated this exponential danger. Nor emphasized that the critical factor was the horizontal mounting of these panels across the ceiling.
Can you walk us through the fundamental difference in fire spread between vertical and horizontal mounting in a confined space like that?
Certainly. So when a fire starts, heat rises vertically. If flammable materials, like these foam panels, are mounted vertically, say, on a wall, the fire tends to progress upwards following the heat flow.
Okay.
Now, this vertical spread, while it's still dangerous, can sometimes be contained, or at least it allows fire safety systems more time to activate. But in this case, the highly flammable foam was mounted horizontally directly over the heads of the patrons.
So the ceiling itself became the fuse.
Precisely. Once the sparklers ignited one small section, the flames immediately spread laterally across the continuous horizontal surface of the ceiling. The fire had a wide, unbroken path of fuel directly above the crowd.
And this configuration, it creates a massive radiating heat source very, very quickly. It dramatically accelerates the rate of heat release into the room.
And this is where a term you sometimes hear, flashover, comes into play, isn't it?
It is. A flashover is the near-simultaneous ignition of all exposed combustible materials in a room. It happens when the room's temperature, driven by a growing fire, reaches a critical point, typically around 600 degrees Celsius.
And because of the materials used and their horizontal placement, the flames spread laterally so quickly that the entire surface area of the ceiling was radiating extreme heat downward. This rapid, widespread heat radiation drastically lowered the time needed to reach flashover.
So in a standard fire, you might have several minutes before a flashover, which gives occupants a window to escape.
Or critical window.
But here, witnesses reported the fire spreading in seconds. That suggests the time to flashover was near instantaneous, effectively turning the entire basement into a deadly inferno almost immediately.
That speed of fire propagation dictated the mass casualty event. The immediate consequences were twofold. First, the extreme heat radiating down made escape physically impossible for anyone not already moving towards the exit.
And second,
The rapid combustion of foam panels generates vast quantities of highly toxic, dark smoke and gases. It cuts off visibility and renders the air immediately unbreathable. This toxic environment, combined with the extreme heat, meant survival depended entirely on being able to exit that venue in the first few seconds.
that structural configuration, prioritizing sound aesthetics over basic safety and material science, created a lethal trap that just required a small, routine spark to activate it. It elevates the investigation far beyond who was holding the champagne bottle.
Far beyond.
So given that the fire spread in mere seconds, we have to turn our focus now to the critical challenge of evacuation. Even the fastest fire might allow for survival if the physical configuration of the Constellation had provided adequate means of egress.
But the sources suggest the venue configuration created deadly bottlenecks.
This is where crowd dynamics get tangled up with architecture. The event was held in the bar's basement, which is a common location for high-energy music parties, to contain the sound.
Mm-hmm.
The bar's website reportedly advertised a capacity of up to 300 people. Witness accounts consistently reported the venue was packed at the time of the fire.
So even if they were slightly under that 300 capacity, you're talking about hundreds of people concentrated in an underground space.
A packed basement now being filled with fire, smoke, and heat radiating from the ceiling in seconds. The immediate survival scenario is just terrifying to imagine.
And this leads us directly to the core infrastructural failure here.
Yeah.
The exit problem. Concerns were immediately flagged regarding the egress points. Survivors consistently reported that access to the ground floor to the street was only provided by a single staircase.
Which they explicitly described as narrow.
A single, narrow staircase. That is a systemic flaw in a venue designed for 300 people. Fire safety codes globally require multiple, separated, and adequately sized exits proportional to the maximum occupancy. That's to prevent a crush.
So what are the specific implications of trying to push hundreds of panicked people through one narrow point?
The consequence is immediate and deadly kinetic energy. When hundreds of people simultaneously rush toward a single inadequate exit, a coordinated evacuation becomes a violent kinetic crush. It's not a stampede where people are running randomly.
No.
It's a crush at the bottleneck. Individuals trip, they fall, and they are instantly compressed or suffocated by the sheer force of the crowd behind them, entirely independent of the fire itself.
And the witness accounts, they paint this horrifying picture vividly. The sources describe a terrifying scramble to escape, leading to a chaotic and really sad scene. The tragedy just compounded the fire damage.
We hear accounts of screaming, of seeing people on the floor not moving. This implies that victims weren't necessarily killed by fire or smoke inhalation right at the start.
But they were immobilized or crushed in the struggle to escape the bottleneck.
Exactly. If the flow rate of people through that narrow staircase was too slow, and with, probably over 100 people trying to get out per meter of exit width, it almost certainly was. The people at the back of the queue were trapped directly under the heat and smoke long enough to be overcome.
That moment when the panic transitions into a deadly crush must have occurred within the first minute, maybe two. It effectively turned the single exit point into a death trap.
And the desperation was visible even outside. Survivors described the chaotic scene on the street where they immediately tried to move severely burned victims away from the site. There were accounts of people giving up their own coats to cover the victims for warmth.
Desperately moving them to nearby bars, trying to provide first aid.
The scale of the immediate human catastrophe was so vast that the untrained survivors were just overwhelmed, scrambling to keep the most severely injured alive until professional help could arrive.
And this analysis of the bottleneck geometry, it ties directly into the legal questions. What does this situation require from the investigating prosecutor?
It requires a thorough reconstruction of the crowd flow and the egress capacity. Prosecutor Pallaude confirmed they would be focusing intensely on emergency exits and establishing the number of people in the venue.
And if that single, narrow staircase was the only functional means of escape, and if the capacity exceeded safe limits for that egress design,
That constitutes a fundamental violation of life safety codes, regardless of how quickly the fire started. The limited egress, combined with the exponential speed of the fire, is the primary factor explaining the high fatality rate.
it seems like a cruel irony. The structure designed to hold the party and the noise became the very mechanism that trapped and killed its patrons.
The scope of the human cost here, it really underscores the international draw of Crans, Montana. While this is absolutely a Swiss tragedy, the victim breakdown illustrates the globalized nature of these high-end resort communities.
The raw numbers are just immense. 40 people confirmed deceased and 119 injured, of which 113 were quickly identified. Let's look at that geographic spread of the injured.
Yeah, the sources show the scale was immediate and cross-border. Of the injured, 71 were Swiss nationals, but the rest represented a dozen nationalities. You had 14 French, 11 Italians, 4 Serbs, and 1 person each from Bosnia, Belgium, Luxembourg, Poland, and Portugal.
Which would require immediate multinational coordination, compounding the logistical challenge for the local authorities.
Immensely. And the nature of the injuries was severe, demanding highly specialized care. We are not just talking about smoke inhalation here.
Absolutely not. Eric Bonvin, the director of the regional hospital in Sion, was very clear that the injuries were life-altering. They would require to be treated for a very long time.
We have to grasp the severity. Many victims were in critical conditions, suffering third-degree burns over 15% or more of their bodies. Medical officials stress that burns of that severity carry a significant risk of death, even with modern treatment.
And treating that many critical burn victims requires a specialized infrastructure that even large national hospitals often lack. What was the immediate medical strategy?
The strategy was dispersal and international resource leveraging. The local Sion hospital was quickly overwhelmed, so casualties were transported far and wide to Lausanne Hospital, and critically, across national borders to specialized burn units.
So they were sent out of the country.
Reports indicate victims were sent to facilities in France, Germany, and even Poland. This massive emergency transfer operation required rapid coordination of air and ground ambulances across multiple countries, all under extreme duress. The sheer scale was so significant that the European Union actually contacted Swiss authorities to offer supplementary medical assistance.
That effort alone speaks volumes about the level of trauma and the inadequacy of localized resources to handle such a sudden, large-scale disaster. And meanwhile, authorities face the even more sensitive, terrible task of identifying the deceased.
Officials, including Matthias Reynard, the regional government president, rightly called this task terrible and sensitive. Due to the extreme heat and fire damage, visual identification was often impossible.
So they had to rely on forensic methods.
Dental records, DNA samples taken from family members, and detailed descriptions of clothing or unique personal effects provided by relatives.
The emotional weight of that process, knowing families are just waiting in agony, it must have been overwhelming for those forensic teams.
It creates immense pressure, and authorities maintained a strict ethical standard stating they would tell families nothing unless we are 100% sure. This commitment to certainty meant the identification process was slow. It was expected to take days, which just prolonged the agonizing uncertainty for those with missing family members.
And the process confirmed the tragedy's impact on this young international clientele.
It did. The first identified victim named publicly was Emanuele Galippini, a 16-year-old Italian international golfer who resided in Dubai. His identity just underscored the loss of youth and promise that defined this whole tragedy.
The logistics of treating the living and identifying the dead, stretching across European borders, turned a local fire into an international catastrophe that required a coordinated global response, all while the community itself was reeling. So we transition now from the scene of the tragedy to the formal legal response. The prosecutor's office has been extremely clear that this is a comprehensive investigation into systemic accountability. It's moving far beyond the simple fact of the ignition.
And that's the necessary approach. The outcome, 40 fatalities from a sparkler, it suggests a profound systemic failure. Prosecutor Pallaude has detailed 5 key focus areas which demonstrate this systemic scrutiny. It covers everything from construction materials to operational licenses.
Okay, let's delve into those key focus areas. First and foremost, they're examining compliance with safety regulations. What does that typically entail in a venue of this type?
It means checking for valid, current fire safety certifications, ensuring fire extinguishers were present and functional, and confirming that the staff had proper training protocols. Second, and maybe most critical to the outcome, the investigation is scrutinizing the specific materials used in the renovation of the bar and its basement.
Which directly targets the non-fireproof foam soundproofing we were just talking about.
Exactly. If those materials were uncertified, unauthorized, or improperly installed in a public venue, that is a direct violation of construction codes.
And third, they're focusing on the venue's operating license itself. Was La Constellation legally permitted to host a mass event of this scale in the basement area, especially with the use of pyrotechnics or shows?
Fourth, they're rigorously checking the availability of fire extinguishers and, crucially, the compliance of the emergency exits. They need to confirm if the venue had the required number and dimensions of exits for its stated capacity.
Specifically, addressing the catastrophic single narrow staircase bottleneck.
Precisely. And finally, fifth, determining the actual number of people inside when the fire began. This will settle the question of potential overcapacity versus the venue's stated limit of 300.
The legal posture is important here. Prosecutor Palau emphasized that no criminal liability had yet been established, stressing that assumptions must not be made before the evidence is analyzed.
That is the procedural bedrock of the investigation. But the owners, Jacques and Jessica Moretti, who are French nationals, they were immediately brought in for questioning. They purchased the bar in 2015.
And it's noted that Jessica Moretti was actually present during the fire.
Yes, she suffered burns to her arm. They were questioned, but importantly, not under caution at that time.
Okay, for the listener, can you clarify that distinction between being questioned and being questioned under caution? What does that signal about the investigation's focus so early on?
Well, being questioned means the authorities are gathering facts. They're treating them as key sources of information about the business, the staff, the renovation history. Being questioned under caution elevates them to formal suspects. It implies the investigators believe they may have committed an offense.
So the initial decision not to caution them suggests the prosecutor was just gathering the basic facts of ownership and operation before pinpointing where the chain of negligence broke.
I think so. But if the materials science investigation confirms unauthorized or non-compliant construction, that status will change instantly.
And if the investigation does establish that the owners or operators failed in their duty of care regarding materials, capacity, or egress, what are the potential criminal consequences?
The potential charges are grave: negligent arson, negligent homicide, and negligent bodily injury. Establishing negligent homicide requires proving that the owner's actions, or their inaction, like failing to ensure fire-resistant materials or ignoring capacity limits, directly caused the deaths.
Which is a very high legal bar.
It is. It requires proof that they knowingly or recklessly allowed a dangerous environment to persist. And the fact that the fire was started by a staff-sanctioned activity will be a significant factor in establishing that negligence.
Now, here is probably the most troubling detail about the oversight. The prosecutor noted it was unclear when the last official fire checks were conducted, but stated that no irregularities were reported during those checks. This suggests the failure extends beyond just the bar's owners.
That detail is deeply concerning, and it raises the question of regulatory failure. If the venue operated with highly flammable, horizontally mounted soundproofing and a single narrow egress point, yet inspectors reported no irregularities,
Then the investigation has to scrutinize the standards and the thoroughness of the inspections themselves.
absolutely. Were the checks superficial? Did the owners renovate the basement after the last inspection? Or, and this is a scary thought, did the local safety standards themselves contain loopholes that exempted certain venue types, like basement music areas, from the rigorous egress requirements imposed on other structures?
Which suggests a potential systemic failure in public safety assurance that allowed this fatal combination of risks to exist in the first place.
So the investigation isn't just about finding a culprit. It's about uncovering a chain of systemic failures that allowed a celebratory resort atmosphere to cloak catastrophic latent risk.
And while that technical and legal investigation proceeds, the community of Crans, Montana, a picturesque resort town known for leisure and celebration, is just grappling with profound devastation. The disaster truly stunned this shell-shocked, close-knit community.
Well, the nature of a resort town like Crans, Montana means the community, while it's international, is also small and interwoven. The high concentration of young people in that venue meant that many local families either had loved ones involved or knew the victims personally. On the night following the fire, the communal grief was palpable. Hundreds gathered in silence near the scene.
Tributes quickly materialized outside the burnt shell of the Constellation. Sources described a makeshift altar growing with flowers, candles, messages, one reading, "Rest in peace among the stars." It's that spontaneous expression of shock when disaster hits a place designed for joy.
And the local quotes, they really capture the depth of the pain. One resident observed simply, "They were people like us," which highlights the human connection lost, not just the international tourist profile. Another resident, Francois, described the feeling of waking up to the news. "We've never experienced anything like this."
For the canton of Valais, the scale of this immediate loss of life is just historically unprecedented. Another young resident, Pier Marco Patani, who was 18 and knew the bar well, he echoed that sentiment. They were people like us. The collective sorrow required an official acknowledgement beyond just the police investigation.
Oh, absolutely. And the government response was immediate and focused on solidarity. The Swiss president, Guy Parmelin, visited the resort, making it clear that the event was one of the most traumatic in the country's history. And in recognition of the profound national and communal loss, Switzerland announced 5 days of official national mourning.
And given the high number of foreign nationals affected, the condolences and support quickly became international.
Global figures reacted immediately. Pope Leo expressed his compassion and solicitude and offered prayers for the victims and the suffering families. French President Emmanuel Macron, due to the number of French nationals injured and the French ownership of the bar, he expressed deep emotion and offered France's full solidarity and fraternal support.
Even the UK Foreign Secretary offered support for any British nationals who might have been affected, emphasizing that this tragedy resonated far outside the Alps.
The coordination of grief, medical support, and identification, crossing all these borders and political lines, it just demonstrates the gravity of the event. A formal ceremony is scheduled for January 9th to remember the victims, a necessary step for a community trying to process such an intense and sudden loss.
This deep dive has necessarily been sobering. We began with that single routine flashpoint, the celebratory sparklers near the ceiling, and we followed the domino effect through a series of exponential systemic failures.
The chemical volatility and high surface area of the horizontal soundproofing materials.
And the catastrophic crowd dynamic created by severely limited egress through a single narrow staircase.
The knowledge nugget here for you, the learner, is really the concept of compounding risk. This tragedy demonstrates that disaster is rarely a simple accident. It is a convergence of a seemingly minor accepted risk, a routine spectacle, with structural vulnerabilities.
The flammable materials, the choke decks.
Exactly. Vulnerabilities that were allowed to exist due to oversight failures or design compromises. This convergence transformed a contained incident into a guaranteed mass casualty event.
So what does this analysis tell us about the broader picture, extending beyond this one resort town?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, this tragedy raises a profound question, not just for Crans-Montana, but for urban centers and entertainment venues globally, particularly those operating in renovated or subterranean spaces. Are modern venues consistently prioritizing spectacle, sound containment, and aesthetic design over fundamental, uncompromising fire safety engineering? The investigation will determine who is legally liable, but our sources show that the specific design choice using non-fire-resistant soundproofing in a high-surface area, horizontal plane, transformed a common New Year's gimmick into a deadly, inescapable trap for hundreds.
That is a deeply important, resonant thought. Thank you for guiding us through this challenging and complex material today, synthesizing the legal, the physical, and the human elements of this tragedy.
My pleasure.
And for you, the listener, here is a final provocative thought to sit with. The materials and structure of that basement were the ultimate accelerant, just waiting for the right spark. What common, seemingly harmless practices in your daily life, if combined with the wrong structural variable at your workplace and a busy public transit area or a favorite local spot, could be waiting to ignite a disaster? Think about your environment, look for the latent risks, and remember what we learned today about the convergence of failure. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.